The doomsday scenario is here for Oklahoma men's basketball. What started as a pretty confident, optimistic feeling within the program heading into Kansas City just a few days ago for the Big 12 tournament, all of a sudden is gone. Oklahoma found out yesterday they will not make the field of 68. They are missing the NCAA tournament for the third consecutive season, all three of those years under Porter Moser. And it took a wild, unexpected turn. So many things had to happen for Oklahoma to miss the tournament, and they all happened. And they not only missed the tournament, they were the first team out. And with that comes all kinds of things to talk about this past season for Oklahoma, what the program's doing moving forward, what's happening right now. And I can tell you guys this, nobody to break it down here than my good friend and colleague, Brody Lusk, here on the OU Insider YouTube channel. Brody, before we get into all the
Yeah.
things that we can talk about, let's just start with yesterday, the selection Sunday. You and I talked briefly beforehand
Mhm.
that I think you and I both felt it was about 50-50 for Oklahoma after what was a crazy weekend with Oregon winning with
Yeah, Oregon.
yeah, well, Oregon, God, so many things.
Oregon,
Oregon winning,
NC State,
NC State, New
FAU
Mexico.
losing.
Hmm.
Yeah. Everything went the wrong way. I mean,
Yeah,
and the odds of all that happening is just it's crazy that it actually happened.
it is, and that's and I think all those things happen, turning Oklahoma from a pretty confident 9 seed to 10 seed at worst to all of a sudden out of the tournament. But heading into the selection show, Brody, where was your head at in terms of Oklahoma's chances, and just what was your reaction when about halfway through that show it became pretty clear Oklahoma was not going to make the tournament?
Well, I was 50-50 on it, and I thought it would kind of come down to two spots for the three schools, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, and St. John's. That was kind of how I was going into it. I thought there was no way Virginia was getting in because when you look at, I mean, honestly, I'm still waiting for someone to provide a good argument for why Virginia was in over Oklahoma. But I thought it would come down to two of those three schools would get in, and then you see Texas A&M got a 9 seed, which I mean automatically I was like, oh, that doesn't bode well for Oklahoma at all. And then Virginia gets in, and that's when you're kind of like they're not getting in. There's just the selection. The whole seeding was very questionable. FAU was a team rumored to be close to the bubble. They got an 8 seed, which was also a bit surprising. You had teams like Boise, who's playing in the first four, that wasn't rumored to play in the first four at all. And so, to see Oklahoma be the first team left out when Virginia gets in, and also to see St. John's, the team that was rumored to be right there behind them, not even in the first four out, it was just very, very questionable decision making, in my opinion. But then again, Oklahoma had a lot of chances to where they could have locked up an NCAA tournament bid. And say what you want about Porter Moser, say what you want about this team. It's just extremely unlucky that everything that took place last weekend took place, and that's a tournament team any other year besides this year.
There were 3 bid stealers the last 2 years combined. There were 5
Mm-hmm.
this weekend. It just and again, I said like 8 things had to go against Oklahoma for this to happen. If one of them goes Oklahoma's way, Oklahoma's in the tournament.
Mm-hmm.
They're the first team out. If if NC State doesn't win, if FAU wins, if New Mexico win, like if any of the or if New Mexico doesn't win, if any
Yeah.
of those things happen, I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about their the controversies that you kind of just
Mm-hmm.
laid out because you already laid it out, and also it's happened. Oklahoma's not in the tournament,
Yeah.
but their resume. I mean, they were 20-12 to end the year. They obviously were one of 5 Power 5 schools that didn't have a quad 2, 3, or 4 loss. They went
Mm-hmm.
undefeated in those games. All their losses came in quad 1 games. Um, but and obviously they play in the Big 12, seen as the toughest conference in college basketball. And, we had said it before. I had said it on the radio that 20 was the magic number
Mm-hmm.
win total for Oklahoma. All that being said, it's pretty clear that they, for one, OU's injuries, I think, played a role, obviously, with JV and McCollum, John Hughley, and Rivaldo Soares all missing that TCU game at the Big 12 tournament. Then you combine that with Their quad one record wasn't very good.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality, I mean, they lost 6 of their last 8 games down the stretch. Injuries or no, they lost some games they needed to win. I don't know, because like you said, any other year they're probably in, but at the same time, I think they earned a bid, but at the same time, this I think back to the Texas Tech game they lost, a game they were up 9 with I think 4.5 minutes to go. Houston game that they lost on a crazy miracle game winner. I think about the UCF game at UCF where they kind of just laid a dud. So
Mm-hmm.
like, there's a lot of stuff that happened outside their control, but at the same time, you win one of those games, or I don't know. They also, it's kind of been the theme under Porter Moser, and I'm not even specifically mentioning it's his fault, but missed opportunities, right? Or should they have just gotten in? I don't even really know how to parcel all of that.
Yeah, and first of all, let me clear something up. I've seen a lot of people saying, on Twitter, various places, that Moser shouldn't have elected to rest the 3 guys that were hurt. Those 3 guys were hurt, and I promise you, Rivaldo Soares would have played if he could have. I promise you, JV McCollum would have won if he could have. So that was not a situation where Moser said, "Hey, we're comfortably in. Just go ahead and sit this one out. We want a 10 seed instead of a 9." It was not like that. But I just think it's incredibly unfortunate. And like you mentioned, there were a lot of games where if one thing went Oklahoma's way, they would be in the tournament. If Jamal Shed or Latrey Darthard would have grabbed that rebound before Jamal Shed got the putback shot, Oklahoma would have been in the tournament. If Texas Tech, that game would have came down to the wire, they would have been in the tournament. So there were a ton of chances for Oklahoma. Then again, you also kind of still feel like they should have been in, but they're not. So it's an unlucky situation, I think, is probably one of the best ways you can describe it. And you hate to see guys like Rivaldo Soares and Latrey Darthard, their seasons came to an end.
Let's talk about this season before we dive into a lot of big picture stuff with Porter Moser and what the transfer portal could look like and what this roster could look like. Let's just talk about the year that
Yeah.
Oklahoma had, because I think in a lot of ways, this was clearly Porter Moser's best team at Oklahoma. I don't think there's any question about that. They were better offensively. Their pace, while they didn't play quite as fast as I thought they would. They did average 2 more possessions per game. Still really in the bottom half nationally. They still play pretty slow, but faster. They finished 8th in the Big 12 in scoring. They finished 8th in the Big 12 in defense. I don't know if I ever thought this was a great team, but I thought they were a decent team. But then, when you look at the specific players, to me, I don't think anybody could have expected Rivaldo Soares to be this good or to play this well.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
He was OU's best player in conference play. But I mean, he averaged 12 points a game on 63% shooting, 51% from 3. That is just bonkers. It's insane. Jalen Moore was their second best player in conference play. I don't think either of those things are controversial. They just were.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, in a good way or in a bad way, how do you feel like the rest of the roster played? Because again, it's another transfer portal group, a whole new group outside of Godwin and Los and Ortega. How good was this team? And outside of those 2 guys, good or bad, anything stand out?
To me, it just felt like they couldn't all mesh together at the right time. Look, I mean, you mentioned Rivaldo Soares. He was very good throughout Big 12 play. The last, I think 12 games of Big 12 play, he averaged like 14.4 points on the absurd shooting numbers that you mentioned. Latrey Darthard had a, stretch in Big 12 play where he wasn't providing really anything. And then the last couple games, he scored in double figures. You had Milos Uzan, who was up and down. I think we would both agree all year. Everyone had expectations for him heading into the season. He averaged 9 points. That was his averages. I don't think he lived up to quite the expectations we had for him. And again, they were high expectations, but there were a lot of games where he kind of, he laid an egg. Ortega always started out conference play on fire. I think he was averaging somewhere close to 15 points per game. You go into conference play, he averages 8 points per game. It's a big difference. And, just felt like Owe wasn't finding ways to contribute in the second half of the year. JV McCollum, he did face his struggles. I think he had to adapt to Big 12 play, but he did have some good moments. You look at the shot against Oklahoma State, and he just had a lot of good games here and there. But I just feel like all these pieces, they couldn't mesh together and play well at the right time. And then you have injuries like John Hughley getting hurt. But I think Rivaldo Swords and Jalen Moore, I think they were consistently playing well. But what you needed was Javian McCollum, Milos Uzan, and Otega Owe, and then Latrey Darthard as well, to also consistently play well. So I think that, to me, when I look at this roster, that was kind of what went into it. And I think the TCU game, Caden Cooper came in, he played, I think we would both agree that considering everything that, the fact that he had not played consistent minutes until then, I think he played pretty well. You had Mox Kleinschek came in, and he struggled at times, but did some good things. I think their depth, once they got injured, wasn't able to help them enough to get them an NCAA tournament bid. And Luke Northweather had some good and bad moments, but I think the consensus takeaway for me with this roster is there were a lot of guys who were inconsistent.
And I think, again, while they were better in some areas as a team, they still, all the things that have plagued this team under Porter Moser, again, plagued them this year. The rebounding was a big struggle. They finished in the bottom half of the Big 12. Turnovers, again, were an issue for this team. And I think some of that's hard because, again, there hasn't been a ton of consistency from year to year, but also those things continue to crop up. And again, outside of Rivaldo Soares, who was really, really good, and Jalen Moore provided some scoring, OU has not had a number one guy. They just haven't. And I think they were thinking it was going to be Javian McCollum, and he led the team in shot attempts and scoring all year and in Big 12 play, but he shot 35% from the field. Los, who I think was better than last year, marginally better last year. I mean, he averaged, his counting stats were a little better. I think 7.6 points a game last year, 9 this year, 3 assists last year, 4.5 assists this year. But his shooting across the board was down. His percentages were down. That he wasn't the guy. Otega averaged 8 points a game on 35% shooting in conference play. You look at the other field of 68 teams, and they all have like a guy.
Yeah.
And right. And OU for 3 years has had maybe a lead ball handler, but they haven't had not only a number one guy, but a guy that is consistently showing up expectedly every game. I don't know how you find that, especially with the roster turnover Porter Moser has had. I don't know how you find that. How do you develop it? It's, to me, aside from all the other team issues, that's been the main thing, is when stuff has gotten tough, there hasn't been a good number one guy every game.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, you just never really know. I think Javian McCollum very well could have been the number one guy this season. I think Milos Uzan very well could have been the number one guy this season. But the problem with the transfer portal, and I think, OU fans are realizing this, and a team I'd mentioned is Arkansas, who took a ton of transfers. I think they very well realize this throughout this season, is that when you take a bunch of transfers, you don't know how they're going to mesh with what you already have in the roster. And to me, I feel like the backcourt, for whatever reason, Javian McCollum and Milos Uzan, they simply didn't play very well together. That's just something you can't really predict when you're taking a transfer or, signing a recruit. So I feel like that definitely plays into it. I think Rivaldo Swords kind of became their number one option late in the season, but even then he really wasn't the guy. Even though he did average the most points and was leading them in scoring. So I feel like they did really miss having someone who would go down there and, win them a game. Look, Javian McCollum won the game against Oklahoma State, but they needed someone to win them a game against Houston, against Texas Tech. And, a lot of those, they make a good shot. Oklahoma didn't have a chance to come back, but I feel like if they would have had a guy, they could have put a lot of these games away that they didn't end up winning, or maybe played closer in games like the Baylor game where they just got blown out of the water, and the same thing happened against the Texas games. So yeah,
that's the other side of it too, man. Is while they had some good showings, and they were in that Texas Tech game, they probably should have won that game. They beat Iowa State to open conference play. They were in that Houston game and had chances to win down the stretch, but there were also, again, just performances where, yeah, you mentioned they got blown out at Baylor. They no-showed at UCF. Even going to Iowa State, that was a rough game. down the stretch. They only scored 45 points in the game. It's maybe the worst game I've ever seen.
Yeah,
You know, going to Texas was to end the regular season was bad. I just again inconsistency and that's been a theme for Porter Moser, but also is there I is that baked into a program like this where you've had so much turnover? I mean, I don't know how realistic is consistency when you're having to rebuild the roster every year? How do you
that
fix that?
that's a really good question. And I think Porter Moser, when you look at it, has recruited really well. His high school recruiting, you can't really knock him on. He's signing two good recruits every single year, but it just seems like year after year they're losing key contributors to the portal, and they have to rebuild that, and you just don't know what the team's going to look like. I don't, the best because look, when Oklahoma was great, look back at the team of Buddy Hield, Isaiah Cousins, Jordan Woodard, Ryan Spangler. Those guys played together for what, 4 years or 3 years? So they were good their senior year. They had played together for so long. Like that team, you knew what you were going to get. It just feels like now, and I don't know if this is consistent to every team in college basketball because of how the transfer portal is now, but it just seems like you're going to have a hard time building a roster of a core group of guys that stick around, play together, get better together, and then go win games. I think you're probably going to see some of that this offseason. But yeah, I think it's hard when you're, in the situation they're in to build a lot of consistency, because the last time Oklahoma had consistency year after year roster wise was that 2015 2016 Final Four team. After that, it's just been roster turnover every single year.
Well, and I think it's really tough too because I think after last season and how disappointing that
Yeah.
was to end the
Yeah.
regular season that way, you went into the offseason thinking, okay, they're keeping if they can keep
Mm-hmm.
Milos Uzan and Otega Oweh, those are your building blocks. Now you've got
Yeah.
consistency, and not only consistency and building blocks, but two young guys that saw a ton of minutes down the
Mm-hmm.
stretch. That was, I think, really ideal. And now, and this isn't a criticism or a shot at them. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot of factors going on too. I don't know if Porter Moser's philosophy mixes with those two guys. I don't think the roster around them has mixed with them well. I also don't think they have developed in a way that was expected.
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden that doesn't seem like your building blocks for one reason or another. And but it's also tough, Brody, because they were better. This team was
Yeah.
better this year. They won 20 games. This was the best year under Porter Moser. To me, man, and I don't even mean this to be unfair, but to me, this is almost a worst case scenario to be better, to show improvement, to have better guys on the roster, to win 20 games, the best year under Porter Moser,
Mm-hmm.
and to still miss the tournament.
Yeah.
That's almost the worst case scenario, to show potential and promise and a really good start to the year only to again
Mm-hmm.
come up short. It's a disaster. It's a disaster.
It is. It's definitely the worst case scenario because now you're going into the offseason. And I think Porter Moser is going to know this, but he has to deliver this offseason. You've got to find a way to put together a team that will make the NCAA tournament next year. I think that's, going to be the consensus among everyone. I don't think there's anybody who's going to disagree with that.
How do you evaluate? Let's get into a big picture thing because I think fans are probably going to be tired of talking about this season.
Yeah.
But look, there's been a lot of takes and a lot of fan reactions since it was announced that OU was going to miss the
Mm-hmm.
tournament. And I think let's try to, it's not going to be popular, but let's try to bring some nuance
Yeah.
and, some critical thinking to this discussion. What's the right way to evaluate Porter Moser's 3 years at Oklahoma? Because to me, and I was just on the radio with our colleague Parker and Mike Steely on KREF, and I kind of got this question, but to me, I feel like you could answer that question for like 20 minutes because I think there's a lot of legitimate complaints that I don't know if he's a great fit for a lot of reasons, schematically, philosophically, culturally. I don't know if he's a great fit. And I think the brand of basketball that's been played by this team the last 3 years has not always been very fun to watch, hasn't been very exciting. I don't and I think there's been a clash with the rosters that he has assembled and the way he wants to play. But at the same time, man, it's been a hell of an uphill battle
Yeah.
since he got to Oklahoma. To have to rebuild the roster every year and still be tasked with competing in the Big 12. And not only that, they did show promise this year. I, I don't but how much is it's like a chicken or the egg thing. It's like how much has some of those issues been outside of Porter Moser's control, not to mention the increase in the transfer portal and NIL
Yeah.
on top of that, and also that Oklahoma basketball has not always been a consistent priority at
Mhm.
Oklahoma. How much is that? How much are those problems outside of his control, and how much are how much does he contribute to those problems with not getting guys to buy in or not getting guys to stay or being too rigid with his philosophies? I'll let you take the floor. How do you evaluate 3 years where you've missed the tournament? I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is.
It's a hard question to answer. I think you hit it right on where you said you could answer this question for 20 minutes. I mean, to me, first of all, I like to acknowledge the fact that he's gotten extremely unlucky with things outside of his control, specifically with the NCAA tournament. What happened this past weekend? I know we don't want to talk about it anymore, but and his first season, he was first four out in both those years, so he was unlucky both those times. If he gets lucky, we're looking at this a lot differently. I think one thing I'll give Porter Moser for this season is that he did make adjustments schematically. They maybe not by much, but they did play different offensively. Um, I think with this year there was a lot of stuff that was kind of outside of Moser's control that made things more difficult for him. And so I think you have to take that in consideration. But ultimately, we said this all off season. We said this, all season. The end goal, what they have to do is make the NCAA tournament, and they didn't do that. When you don't make your goal at the end, they failed. And so I think, to me, now you're going into the SEC, which is not as good of a conference basketball wise. Granted, it's still a good conference, but it's nowhere near close to the Big 12. So you're not playing as brutal of a schedule as they did this year. And look, another thing I want to point out that was very unfortunate for Oklahoma, they played Arkansas, USC, and Providence. Those three teams were consensus NCAA tournament teams, heading into the season. Everyone thought, okay, those three teams will be in the tournament. USC, they had the 5 stars, didn't work out. Arkansas, a lot of people picked them to be their national champion, didn't work out. Providence had their best player get injured. So they got unlucky in that aspect as well, strength of schedule wise. But I don't know, man. It's just a really hard question to answer because I truly think Porter Moser is a good coach. Now, is he in the right situation? I can't answer that question because I don't know. But I don't know. I just think we're setting up for the most interesting offseason we've seen with Oklahoma basketball in a long time. And I said that same thing last offseason. So it'll be interesting. But I think, there's a lot of people who are very frustrated with Porter Moser. I think you're valid. You're right to be frustrated with him in some aspects, but I don't know. It kind of goes both ways, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the nuance comes from I look, and like you said, I completely understand any fan that's frustrated with Porter
Yeah.
Moser specifically and the program as a whole. I
Yeah.
completely look. It doesn't ultimately it doesn't really matter why everything happened and what went Oklahoma's way or what went against Oklahoma in a way they couldn't control. It doesn't matter because ultimately they've missed the tournament 3 years in a row.
Mhm.
It's unacceptable
Yeah.
from a program standpoint, from a fan standpoint. It's unacceptable. That can't happen. It just can't. The other side of it, though, is that I think it's lazy to just say, "Oh, he needs to be fired." I
Yeah.
I I think that take. I'm not even saying there's not merit to it,
Mhm.
but let's have a dis. I'm not even advocating for Porter to be fired. I'm not saying that's never the correct decision. What I'm saying is we need to have a nuanced discussion about everything that's happened the last 3 years, the legitimate criticisms of Porter Moser and the things that are outside of his control that have actively worked against him. So then the question becomes, how do you fix it? What do you fix? Because a lot of people are going to point to they need a new arena.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I've covered every OU men's basketball game at the Lloyd Noble Center the last 3 years. I can speak that the Lloyd Noble Center is not the most conducive environment for a Power 5 college basketball team. It's not.
No.
It's not. And the NIL resources at Oklahoma aren't there like they are at other schools.
Mm-mm.
They're just not. And OU is never going to be a transfer portal destination for high caliber players in the portal. It's just not.
No.
How do you So what's the fix? Does a new arena really fix it? That's like, I'm not saying it can't, but does it? I am skeptical that all of the problems are going to be solved, or even a lot of the problems are going to be solved by a new arena. I don't know. I don't think it's that simple. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's that simple either. There's a lot more that goes into it, and at the end of the day, a new arena is not going to be ready for a couple years, so that's not going to fix, the next couple seasons.
Right.
And look, say what you want about the LNC. I personally agree that it's not a good basketball venue, but there was good crowds there this season. You can mention a handful of games where the crowd was pretty solid. So
Yeah.
to me, the biggest thing, I think it comes down to the roster. I think that's how Porter Moser's going to fix the problems. And, NIL wise, he's in a difficult position. Now, OU does have pretty solid NIL, but it's, nothing crazy. Like when you're going to get a high tier recruit and you're competing with the Kansases of the world, those schools are putting all their money into basketball. So it's difficult. But at the end of the day, I think Porter Moser has to figure out a way to build a roster that will, one, stay together, because you got to build some type of roster consistency, and two, you got to find a way to get some solid players and some athletic big men onto this team, because that's been a problem I think Oklahoma's had for a long time. So to me, I think if Moser can put together a roster that I would say is more equipped to play the way he wants to, if he wants to play faster, you got to build a team that's a little bit more equipped to play faster. And you got to figure out, look, who's the guy we're building around this offseason. And then you got to go and you got to build a team around him. You got to find someone who's going to be a guy. Oklahoma hasn't had a guy since Austin Reeves. He's been the last player that came through Norman that was going to go, and look, he would win you a game. So they got to hit on portal targets this offseason. They got to hope that the two freshmen they have coming in, who, by the way, I think will be able to contribute in year one, they got to hope they can. So I think, roster management, I would say that is going to be the biggest way you can fix it. But facilities, I've talked with a couple of different recruits who have said, the fact that they're getting new facilities does play into their decision making, and they see that's something that they would, very much like to see. So I do think that is going to play a factor into it. Now, how big of a factor, I'm not sure, but a new arena, even if it's 5 years down the line, I think it would help. I think it would help some things.
I agree. Look, I want to be clear. I think a new arena would certainly help, but I think you mentioned the important point here, which is we are years away from that. Not to mention that if a new arena happens, it's likely not going to be done by the school. It's going to be done by the city. And that comes with a whole new set of circumstances and how that would happen, and how do taxpayer money, how does that come involved, all that stuff. And I think you mentioned it though, because ultimately I think men's basketball at OU is an interesting thing from a fan perspective, because while I think there are people who just really love college basketball and they love OU basketball, it's OU is a football school first and foremost. It always has been. And then you throw in the rise of softball, and college softball is just humongous and it's getting bigger. I don't see an end in sight. And OU softball is at the front of that. Then you throw in the success for women's gymnastics. You throw in the success for women's basketball, who just earned a 5 seed in the tournament under 3 years under Jenny Baranczyk. It's 2 5 seeds and a 4 seed, including this year where they had to replace a ton of the roster. They still get a number 5 seed. I think ultimately almost more than anything, men's basketball is tied to their fan involvement is tied to both the success of the program and how fun they are to watch. And I think more than almost any other program, like when men's basketball is really, really good, people care. When it's not very good, people don't really care. And that sounds simple, but like I think ultimately it to really re-energize the fan base and this program, I think it's going to have to start with getting people to buy into the program. And that's increasingly difficult when you're having to turn over the roster every year. So again, it's like a bunch of problems with no clear answers colliding. And I don't know how you fix it. I don't know how you fix it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know the answer to that either. I think there's a lot of different factors that play into it, I would say. But it's going to be interesting to see how they go about it this offseason. Hopefully they can get some things figured out with the arena and stuff like that. But yeah, I think you hit it right on when you mentioned that Oklahoma's a football school, and then second is softball. And I think men's basketball would probably get into the third tier with baseball, women's basketball, gymnastics, all that you mentioned. So the way you turn Oklahoma back into a school that cares about basketball a lot more is you got to get a team that's going to be successful, because back in 2015-16, I know I've already mentioned that season once, but that Oklahoma, the
It was
LNC was
incredible.
rocking that year.
Mhm.
Again, it's not a great basketball venue, but it was looking good. So yeah, I think I think to me it starts and ends with the success of the team. But I think there's a lot of different factors that go into how much success can someone at Oklahoma basketball, can a head coach coaching at Oklahoma in men's basketball have? I think that's a question that is up in the air.
And all that being said, I thought generally the crowds at the Lloyd Noble Center this year were better than they
Yeah.
were last year. And look, and it's weird because Oklahoma ranked ninth in attendance this year in the Big 12. They ranked ninth out of 14 teams, which is fine. It's not the
Hmm.
worst, but again, goes to show that I mean they're averaging a little under 10,000 in attendance, which is about half of what
Yeah.
the Lloyd Noble Center holds. So I, but I did think it was better. I think Porter has done about as good of a job as he could from
Yeah.
a getting people actively involved and getting energy. I think he's done about as well as you could ask. The thing that's been missing has been consistent success. And I think if OU had won 24 games this year, if they had won that Texas Tech game or that Houston game, I actually think it could have been different.
Hmm.
But and it's so hard because again, not to try to make this more complicated, but it's also hard because if all of this stuff doesn't happen this weekend, OU's in the tournament.
Yeah.
OU's in the tournament. And now we're having a completely different discussion about how okay, the progress has finally been showed. Oh, in a pivotal third year under Porter Moser, they made the tournament. They were
Mhm.
better. They won 20 games. Now we're talking about the field and how big this is for OU moving forward into the SEC. So it's like, of course, you can. They didn't make it. All that being said, they didn't make it, and they had chances to make it, and they didn't make it, and that's worthy of criticism. But it's also crazy how one result can change the entire way we're discussing this program.
Yeah.
I don't, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. It's very difficult. Yeah, I think Porter, and he mentioned this in the statement that he released last night, but the students and the crowd, as you said, they were much better this year. And the students especially seemed like, to me, every single game, there was a pretty decent showing from the student section. So, and that's one thing that Moser's been very vocal about throughout his time at Oklahoma. You see him before the season going out trying to get people to come, watch. But again, if you have a really good team that's winning games in conference play, I believe personally that there will be fans at the LNC, and we saw that in games this year. So yeah, it's crazy because it took NC State going and winning 5 straight games. If that doesn't happen, again, this is a different conversation. So there's a lot of factors that go into it that make it complicated.
Before we look forward real quick, I should have mentioned this earlier. Uh, Were you surprised that OU didn't take the NIT bid? Because to me, that didn't surprise me. I assumed,
I
and you and I
assume.
briefly talked about it too. I assumed if they didn't make the tournament, they were not going to the NIT. That was just an assumption I had, and I hadn't talked to anybody at the program. But to me, it didn't make sense. But I know it also frustrated some fans that they didn't take it. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I think a lot of people saw Tom Crean on ESPN. He went on a little rant about it. But then again, he also declined an NIT bid when he was the coach at Indiana. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to
He's
me.
an
But
ESPN employee. Of the ESPN holds the NIT. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, yeah. You saw a lot of people, a lot of different schools decline the bid. Indiana. I think
St. John's.
St.
St.
John's, yes.
John's.
Providence, I'm pretty sure declined it. But so there were a lot of teams. It didn't surprise me. They are a little banged up. You look at the injuries, like JV McCollum. He could have played in the NCAA tournament. He would have played in the NCAA tournament. But with his injury, it's probably not something that you want to risk banging up a little more in the NIT. And then again, I don't think a lot of people watch the NIT at all. So I just, you hate it for the guys that their collegiate career is done, but I think it made the most sense for them to decline the NIT bid, and ultimately it didn't surprise me.
2 years ago, when they took it, when they were among the first four out and they took the NIT bid, got to host a couple of games. Like, to me, that it made more sense then,
Yeah.
because it was Porter Moser's first year at the program. And I think it made sense to, hey, we've got a shot to play more games. We can continue to build our culture, and we're hoping to bring some of these guys back. And so we can that's just more opportunities for everyone to get in sync with each other, all that stuff. And hey, it's progress just to make the NIT and get to host some games. But now, after missing the tournament for the third year in a row, and I don't know how much of an expectation is that a lot of these guys are going to be back, and then you add the injuries on top of it. I don't, I think you can legitimately argue that Caden Cooper and Luke Northweather getting more minutes could maybe help. But I also think people have to understand that when it comes to something like the NIT, everybody has to be on the same page,
Yeah.
from the players to the coaches to the administration. Everybody has to be on the same page, because especially after such a gut punch yesterday, I think you have to have everybody not only wanting to do it, but motivated to do it. And also, I think it's a tough thing if you're Porter Moser and you don't really know what your roster is going to look like a few days from now.
Well, yeah, and the transfer portal opened up today.
Yeah.
You got to be on that, figuring it out, and the ones who are going to leave, they can go ahead and leave, and you're going to figure out your roster for next season. So I think it made the most sense, especially with how the transfer portal is nowadays. If the transfer portal didn't open until 3 weeks, then maybe it makes a little bit more sense. But the NIT is not the standard. What you want to do is the NCAA tournament. So I agree with them declining the bid, and didn't really surprise me.
I understand some fans being frustrated. I do, that they didn't take the NIT. I completely get it. But I also think, if you really think about it, it just didn't make a ton of sense to do it. So that moves us into, you mentioned it, transfer portal is open today. I'm a little surprised that since we started this video that there hasn't been any official announcements from a couple of players, at least not that I haven't seen that yet, at least. You have been saying it at OUinsider.com for a little bit now, and we've talked about it privately, but I think there is an expectation that there are some guys on this roster, some notable guys on this roster, who are not going to be back next year, or at the very least are going to test the waters in the transfer portal. And outside of Rivaldo Soares and Latrade Arthur and Mox, everybody else can come back. Those are the only three guys that are that are exhausting their eligibility. So, I know there's some stuff we can't fully get into, but what should the expectation be that OU retains a lot of these guys? And if you're Porter Moser in this staff, do you not do you don't want to lose anybody, but
I get
you don't like,
I think
what's your mindset?
I think so for me, and one of the things I mentioned last night on the transfer portal thread up on the board, for me, I think at the end of the day, the players who want to leave and go elsewhere, I think it's for the best that happens. For whatever reason they have, the reasons vary. I think it's for the best because right now Oklahoma only has one open scholarship. And until people transfer, that number will stay at one. I think there'll be quite a few transfers from Oklahoma. That's what I'm expecting. And so, I think it's for the best that a couple of them that are looking to transfer go ahead and do transfer. So I would expect, I would say 3 to 4 transfers. I think it is probably the number to expect for people, looking at how many are they going to lose. I think they will lose some people who are considered potentially, pretty valuable players. And then again, I also think that this is for the better. I do know that there are a couple players on the roster who are a little bit undecided with their decision because you got to mull all the options that go together. And one important note this year is that 2-time transfers, as long as they enter in the first 45 day period, they can transfer without having to get a waiver. But then again, Oklahoma is bringing in Dayton Forsyth and Kowal next season. Now, one thing I will say, I think Dayton Forsyth, he's been getting a ton of hype. He deserves it. He's a stud from Dale. Should win Gatorade Player of the Year in Oklahoma. He will be able, I promise you, he'll be someone who can come in and play year one. And now, a player that's not being talked about that much is Kowal. Kowal has the potential to be the best option offensively on Oklahoma's roster next season. He's 6'9", still growing, has a massive wingspan, elite shot blocker, elite three-point shooter. So Moser is bringing in a really good recruiting class, but he is going to lose some guys. So to me, I think, I'm curious your opinion on this. I think you got to build it around Jalen Moore. Jalen Moore is the centerpiece heading into next season.
I agree. Absolutely. And I think that's not only because he earned that with the way he played. There were as much as Rivaldo Soares probably ultimately was the best player in conference play. I think Jalen Moore was maybe the most consistent player in conference play. He averaged 12 points a game, that was second on the team. He averaged 8 rebounds a game in conference play. That led the team. His defensive versatility, they asked him to do a lot. They asked him to shoot threes as a stretch 4. They asked him to play the 5 in some parts as a small ball center. Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that too is, look, let's just say it. I mean, I think a lot of the focus about who's going to potentially transfer out is Miles Hughes and Otega Oweh.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, it's because both of those guys had complicated seasons. And all you have to do is look at the fact that Otega Oweh started as one of the most exciting players on this team to begin the season, and not only struggled mightily in conference play, but was benched the last few games of the year. And so I think when you throw all that into the mix, you have to think about, okay, and then we'll see what happens with JV McCollum and some other guys. I don't want to speculate too much. Hell, I mean, there could be stuff that happens by the time we finish this video.
Yeah.
So I don't want to speculate too much, but yeah, I think keeping Jalen Moore is absolutely a priority, almost regardless of what happens elsewhere on the roster.
Yeah.
And I think you build around Jalen Moore. And then I think the other thing is you've got to get, you mentioned it earlier, a big man, like a really good big man, I think has got to be a real priority for this team. And Brandon Garrison is into the portal from Oklahoma State. He's an Oklahoma native, has a lot of promise. And that's been, if you're looking at structurally in terms of depth chart, what's really hurt this team is a lack of a consistent presence inside. And John Hughley gave some of that off the bench this year, but he averaged under 4 rebounds a game and struggled. I mean, he had 3 or more fouls in 6 of the 11 conference games he played this year. And I think they need somebody that can play like 30 minutes a game. And be a real presence on both ends of the floor.
Yeah, you mentioned Garrison. I have a note up on him on the board right now, but it's very early. He just entered the transfer portal today, but it does seem like if I were to tell you 3 schools that I could see, Garrison considering, it would be Oklahoma, Kansas, and, potentially depending on who Oklahoma State hires back to Oklahoma State. So, in Kansas, Obviously, they're returning a lot of bigs next year. So it'll be very interesting. But I agree. I think if you can, to me, if you can find an elite, someone who can shot protect, someone who's athletic, someone who can play, like you mentioned, 30 minutes a game and score down low in the post, someone who's, 6'10 plus, Brandon Garrison fits that. I think you put that next to Jalen Moore and you put that next to Koala Tack, you're looking at a solid front court next season because Sam Godwin, earlier in the year, I get it, he went through senior day, but earlier in the year, he wrote a piece for Sooner Sports on what it meant for him to be a Sooner. And he said he had 2 years of eligibility and he plans on using them both. So I would be shocked if Sam Godwin didn't return to Norman next year. So if they can get that, and I think ultimately, regardless of what happens with who they have in the backcourt, you got to find another guard who can go get your buckets. And that's, one thing they have done. They reached out to Jacob Cruz from UT Martin, who's, a scorer. They reached out to, one of the transfers from Canisius. And they're also on a local JUCO kid. So it's interesting, but I think to me, this is the most interesting portal season for Moser that he's had so far because you have the opportunity to bring back some really good pieces like a JV McCollum, like a Jalen Moore. So depending on how they do that depends on how you build your roster. But I think they'll probably have to take maybe 4 transfers this season. So it'll be interesting to see how they go about it and who goes about it. But yeah, I'm shocked we haven't heard any type of news transfer-wise for Oklahoma yet at the time recording this.
Well, and I think to wrap all this up, the reality is, as you just mentioned, they're going to have to take a handful of transfer guys, which means unless some shocking developments happen or don't happen, this is going to be yet another offseason that Porter Moser is going to have to retool the roster primarily through the transfer portal. And you mentioned that the 2 incoming freshmen, I think we're both very high on, and both of them, and especially Forsyth, who's an Oklahoma kid who just had another incredible run at Dale for a 3rd straight title, our high school championship. Is huge. All that being said, they're going to have to get some guys in the transfer portal again. And that is really difficult heading into a 4th year under Porter Moser where the seed is hot. It just is. Some of that's fair. Some of it isn't, I think. But some of it's fair. And ultimately, the OU hasn't made the tournament in his 3 years at OU. And next year, it's tournament or bust for Porter, for the coaching staff. I think for the program, honestly, in some respects.
Yeah.
That's just, I mean, I was going to ask you how hot the seat is for Porter Moser. It's pretty hot. I mean, you can't go 4 years without making the tournament. You can't. It just can't happen.
And to me, I don't see he's not getting fired after this season. But is, going into next year, if you're doing a hot seat list, he's got a hot seat. Tournament, you're good. No tournament, you're not so good. So I think it's really that simple. Make the tournament in year 4. If you miss tournament in year 4, that seat is like blazing hot. But yeah, I think he has a pretty hot seat right now.
I agree with you. I would be shocked if I have no expectation that Porter Moser is going to get fired. That doesn't. That's. I don't think that's as much as I know some fans want that. And again, I think there's a lot of the criticism that's legitimate and fair. I don't think he's going to get fired for a multitude of reasons. The biggest of which is that OU's going into the SEC. I really don't think they want they don't want a new coach heading into a brand new conference. They don't want that. However, I think on a list of coaches that are on the hot seat, I think Porter Moser's at the top of the list heading into next season. And I do think if they don't make the tournament next year, he's gone. And again, I think some of that's fair. Some of it's not fair, but ultimately I think this is the most important offseason for Porter Moser and the OU men's basketball program that they've had in a really, really long time. Really long time. Yeah. And that's a tough task.
It is. It's just going to be extremely interesting how they go about, this offseason. Truly, I don't know. I don't know how you go about it. I think it'll be very interesting to see how they build a roster for next season because you want to go into next season. You don't want to have another team where you're like, ooh, this team could make the tournament. You got to build a roster where you're confident this team is going to go to the tournament because at the end of the day, his job's on the line for him.
It is. And look, I think it wouldn't surprise me if in a few days we're back here making another video after we see some developments or don't see developments in the transfer portal. I think both of us expect to see some movement, if not later today, within the next few days. It's going to be a crazy few days for the OU men's basketball program, and there's going to be a lot to break down. Everybody's going to want to make sure you go head over to ouinsider.com. You're going to get analysis and updates from Brody and I over on the VIP subscriber board. You're going to want to make sure to stay tuned into the OU Insider YouTube channel. We're going to have tons of content here, not to mention that the women's basketball team is playing in the NCAA tournament as a 5 seed this coming weekend. Big game, big opportunity for Jenny Baranczyk and the Sooners. OU softball still underway. They're undefeated in conference play through 2 series. The OU baseball team is absolutely killing it right now. OU baseball is killing it. They're 6-0 in conference play. They're in pretty much every single college baseball poll as of today. OU football spring practices are underway. A lot of stuff you're not going to want to miss. And I think, at the top of that list, the OU men's basketball program is going to be something to watch. So everybody make sure you tune in, and we'll be back with you on the next episode of In the Paint.